Hey guys, my name is Francis Booker. Welcome to Under the Hooded. So today I wanted to talk about something that has been on my mind for a while. And I finally organized my thoughts and decided I was just going to make a video about it. So today I want to talk to you guys about LitRPGs. If you guys have never heard of LitRPG, I don't really blame you. To be honest, I had never heard of them until about probably 2 years ago. And when I first heard about them, I was just shocked because it's such a large kind of underground community that most people don't know about. And I was just absolutely flabbergasted that I had never even heard of the genre. It was an entire genre that had just never come up in my entire life. So what is a LitRPG exactly? So it stands for a literary RPG, which is essentially a book, short story, any kind of written story that was really heavily inspired by RPGs from video games. And predominantly, they all feature some kind of leveling system and in-game statistics that their characters use. They're really interesting to me because they let stories be told from this very concrete place that it's difficult for most other fantasy stories to achieve. And what I mean by that is that most fantasy stories have to deal with characters having certain powers and certain superhuman abilities. But it's usually very difficult to quantify exactly how strong one character is relative to another. And there have been ideas and terms that have been thrown around to explain that. One of my ones that I personally heard and used frequently is the difference between hard and soft magic systems. And it can be really difficult to pull off a hard magic system, one where the rules are really concretely defined and you can always understand exactly what to expect from them. LitRPGs, though, really force the reader and the writer into this position where it has to be this hard magic system, because you are being boiled down to concrete numbers. You have a level. Your strength has a number, your agility has a number, and they're really interesting to me because of that. And they usually allow stories to be told from a very different perspective than how other novels are really presented. And I think they're fascinating because of that. That being said, there are some serious problems with the vast majority of LitRPGs out there. And I don't know exactly why. So many of them suffer from this problem. One of my personal guesses is that these problems have become almost staples of the genre. And that's a big thing in writing. If you guys are interested, one of the big things whenever people write books is that they do research on genres to figure out what are the tropes that are expected? What can I do to mimic those tropes? Because people want them and they're expecting them and they're what's going to sell well. And I think that a lot of these LitRPGs are suffering because people are copying tropes that are detrimental to the story. And people enjoy them. I've always been curious. So if you guys want to, leave me a comment explaining your thoughts on LitRPGs and your thoughts on some of the problems that I'm going to talk about. Because it seems to me that a lot of people really enjoy them, and I can't understand why. And so I'd like to. If people can explain to me what it is about these tropes that they like, or if these are all detrimental things that people just are perpetuating. I'm really interested to hear it. But today I really want to go over my opinion about what are some of the biggest problems facing LitRPGs and why they should be avoided. The first one that I have is a combination of an uninteresting world and what feels to me like very much a copying of other people when you could come up with your own original ideas. And that's that most LitRPGs, if you were to grab a LitRPG right now off of wherever you get your LitRPGs, odds are it's going to start with somebody putting on some kind of headset, some kind of neural interface, whatever they want to call it, and entering a VR MMORPG. So many LitRPGs use this premise of VR MMORPG. and I've never really understood why. Because it's an interesting idea on the surface, but it's one that's been really done to death. And most stories don't utilize that. Most stories don't really go into an analysis of, what would this mean if we had virtual reality this good? How would that affect people? What would that do? That very rarely seems to be the focus of the story, and the VR MMORPG seems to just be a vessel for them to enter the RPG portion of the LitRPG. And it confuses me because there are LitRPGs out there that do this well. And I'm not going to name any particular books today. I don't really want to go into which ones I've read and which ones I've liked and which ones I didn't like. But there are plenty of examples out there of LitRPGs that don't use VR MMORPG as a crutch like that. There's a lot of stories out there that just use the RPG element as world building, and that's interesting. That really is a thing that takes a LitRPG and boils it down to something that's cool. It's not like you go on to read a high fantasy novel full of elves and dwarves, and somebody puts on a video game console to go into that world. We don't really need a reason to go into a fantasy world. And so I've always been confused why we need a reason to go into a LitRPG world. And there's a lot of examples of worlds that are just, hey, this is how the world is. There are levels, there are stats, there are items and abilities, and they're all quantified. That's just how the world is. It's not a question of why, it's just how it is. And I think part of the reason why people are afraid to do that is it can throw people off. And I actually got some of this when I was writing our book, The Hooded. When we were writing it, one of the things about The Hooded is that everybody in that world has Morar, which is if you haven't read it, the power that they use in The Hooded. Everybody has it. It's not unique. It's something that everybody has. It's unique that the Hooded, who are the kind of main group in the book, train in it almost exclusively, but just having that power isn't special. It's just part of their world. For them, using Morar is about as natural as throwing a ball is. It's nothing necessarily special. Now, not everybody trains, their entire life to play baseball or something. That's essentially what the Hooded are. And so in that regard, they become special. But they're not special because they can throw the ball. They're special because of how well they can do it. And I think that's kind of one of the similar problems that LitRPGs have, is that people are afraid to not explain why this world is the way that it is. And I think that's something that we need to move past and have more LitRPGs that really use the RPG portion of it as a way to build out the world and flesh out the world. And especially because having it as part of a video game causes like a little bit of a dissonance for me. And I'm going to go more into what I mean about that in a little while. Number one, some stories, it really is just a vessel. They go into the game and they never come out. And it seems cheap to me that there's even this kind of other framing level of the story. And then in some, they come in and out. And in that regard, it can be more interesting, but those kind of usually have their own set of problems, which I'll deal with in a little while. So one of the other things that I find really annoying is that whenever I pick up a LitRPG, even if it is VR MMORPG, I'm already I'm on the fence usually when I see that, but I'm willing to give it a chance. Then what usually happens is, in a large portion of these stories, it's the end of the world. The world is coming to an end. It's the newest plague. Meteors coming. The world is being torn asunder. Some kind of end of the world experience, and the only way for a person to survive is to go into this VR MMORPG. And that has also always confused me, because again, like I mentioned, it's a bit of a crutch to try and explain the world. But the other thing is that it really has no bearing on the story. At least in the early chapters, and I usually don't get past the early chapters because of that. Usually these stories start out really interesting. I'm like, oh wow, this is the end of the world. This is something huge, the main character gets some kind of horrible injury or something like that. And I'm invested. I'm like, okay, I see where you're going. This is, something big is happening. Then they log into the game, and all of a sudden, their biggest concern goes from, it was the end of the world 5 minutes ago, to, ooh, what class am I going to pick? And I've never been able to rationalize a character choice like that, because I just picture myself in that situation and how picking my class, I mean, yes, I'm starting a whole new life, it's important, but it would be colored by the fact that I just left an old life. You know, it's like a story about an immigrant who leaves a war-torn country, leaves his family behind, immigrates to a new country, and is immediately like, man, I am so excited to get my first job in this new country. It's a little jarring. You know, obviously there's some level of that. There's some level of the newness of it. There's some level of the, you know, fresh start. And, you know, that's definitely legitimate. But there's also some level of grief that just usually isn't present and has always confused me. And it also feels like it weakens the characters, because it makes the characters' initial struggles feel worthless. It makes them feel like they're not real characters, and that immediately breaks my immersion in the story. A couple other issues that are minor that a lot of LitRPGs seem to suffer from. Number one is the issue about what happens when you die. And I think the problem that people have with this is, again, it's a video game, and some people are comfortable with the just, if you die, you're dead. And some of them really have, are trying to, I think, lean more into the video game aspect of, if you die, you can start over. The problem, though, with that is that it cheapens character death and makes the story lose a lot of the tension, because suddenly I'm not sure what the worst case scenario is. It sounds like the worst case scenario is you have to try again, which really doesn't make me feel on the edge of my seat. Another issue, and I think that this is an issue that goes well beyond LitRPGs. I think this is an issue in a lot of stories. But LitRPGs seem to be particularly susceptible to it, is having Mary Sue overpowered characters who just kind of breeze through life and aren't really challenged. I'm of the personal opinion that main characters should have a disadvantage, and they should have to work twice as hard to make up for that disadvantage, and they should have to really struggle to get successes. I think that makes characters more interesting and makes them more fleshed out. Obviously, there are exceptions to that, and there are people who have been able to write phenomenal stories without those, but that has been some of my more recent thoughts on character development, is that if things are coming easy to the main character, it usually makes it less interesting. In LitRPGs, a lot of the times, for whatever reason, the main character has an ability that nobody else has that makes everything easy, or if they're just unnaturally good at, you know, using the RPG system or something like that. And that always, I feel like, weakens the story overall. And it's much more interesting if the main character has an ability that's a weakness, something that he has to learn to use or overcome, or they don't understand the system and everybody else does, and they're kind of starting off at a disadvantage, and it's something that they have to work on throughout the course of the story. I think that those make more interesting stories, and they're less common in LitRPGs. The last issue that I have is that a lot of LitRPGs really lean into the video game aspect, like I mentioned earlier. But the thing is, it's not an RPG. It's a story, first and foremost. It's a story that borrows really heavily from RPG elements, but really first and foremost, it is a story. And I think having those priorities set is kind of important, because the way that video games are made, the way that RPGs are made, and the way that those are experienced by us is totally different than how it would be if all of that was how reality worked. And a lot of LitRPGs try and lean into that, which is one of the kind of conflicting things for me, is they want to make it as video game-like as possible, but they also want to make it different. They want to make it seem like, oh, but it's different when it's real life. And very few of them consider some of the more technical aspects of it. And this might be an issue of I don't tend to finish those lit RPGs that I don't like, because it does tend to be that the ones that I do like take this into account. So please correct me if I'm wrong, that a lot of other ones don't take this into account. But so maybe this is more of an idea that I think more people should run with than it is that not enough people are running with it. But I think that it's interesting. If you had a world where numbers really controlled what you could and couldn't do, it really does change the dynamic of how the world would be run. And so one example, I won't name what story this was, but I did read a lit RPG once where there was experience points, and you would level up if you got enough experience points. And after a certain level, it became more and more difficult to get experience, and it became more and more difficult to level up. What some people in that story figured out, though, was there were ways to get a lot of experience really quickly. It's just that it involved killing people, and it involved really immoral combat. And that was interesting because it was done by the villains, obviously, but it was interesting because it was very realistic. You know, if you have a world where there is this really concrete system, there are people who are going to try and get around that system. And there's limits to what they can do and what they can't do. And really exploring that, and this wasn't a thing that was explored until well into the series, but really exploring that made me feel like, oh wow, you know, this really is what this would be like if the world worked on a system like this. So my point really is that I think people need to consider some of these things when they're writing lit RPGs, and they need to understand what it is that's going to strengthen their story and what it is that's going to weaken their story. And I think a lot of the things that lit RPGs do right, they do really right, and it makes for a really interesting story, and it makes for a really fun story. But a lot of the things that they do wrong really can take all of that away in an instant. And so I think there really does need to be this balance struck between, you know, what are we going to do, what's convention, and what would make the story better. Those are my personal opinions on it, though. I'm really interested to hear what you guys think. If any of you guys read lit RPGs, if any of you guys write them as well, I'm curious what your thoughts are on my comments and what your thoughts are on lit RPGs in general. With all that, though, I've been Francis Booker. Thank you guys for watching. You guys can check out the links in the description below for all of our fun stuff, website, Twitter, book, and I will talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.